March 5, 1946. A cold wind moves across the flat streets of Fulton, Missouri, while a modest college chapel fills with townspeople, students and guests who have traveled in pressed coats and careful shoes. The Allied victory is less than a year old, yet the mood is not celebratory. It is attentive, steady, and edged with concern that the peace may be harder than the war. The visiting figure at the center of this scene is Winston Churchill, introduced by the President of the United States in an appearance that seems informal on the surface and deeply calculated beneath it. The setting is small, but the stakes feel larger than the walls can hold. Listeners carry recent memories of ration books, telegrams, and blacked-out windows, and now they listen for a new map of the world. What follows draws on public records, archived press bulletins, published transcripts, and contemporaneous reporting. Names of institutions and locations are part of the historical frame. Interpretive turns are offered with caution. This program remains a speculative reconstruction based on available documentation and period accounts. It does not claim access to private intent, and it avoids certainties where none exist in the written trace. The narrative keeps to the time and language of 1946 as best as possible, and it treats official lines and alternative readings with equal restraint. Every detail here aims to remain within the credible routines of that winter: train schedules, college programs, newspaper deadlines, and diplomatic courtesies, so the listener can consider how a single speech in a quiet American town might have signaled a broader, colder season. We proceed with measured steps, guided by what the paper trail can show and what the moment itself might plausibly have felt like to those in the room. The day began with an ordinary Midwestern chill and a practiced sequence of courtesies. Fulton's streets were tidy, the storefront windows clear, the sidewalks clean but sparsely trafficked as residents made their way toward Westminster College. Inside the chapel, ushers guided arrivals to simple wooden seats. The smell of polish, paper programs, and winter coats hung in the air. A faculty procession formed with calm order, neither pompous nor casual, and the college's modest banners settled into place above the aisles. The United States had celebrated victory less than a year earlier, yet the audience did not bring a parade mood. They carried a practical awareness of food prices, housing shortages, and returning veterans looking for work. Many had followed the shifting headlines since the Potsdam days, tracing lines on Europe's map with fingers against the newsprint. The president's presence offered a reassuring American frame, though it also suggested that the message to come might stretch beyond academic courtesy. From the outside, the event could pass for a standard lecture on current affairs. Inside, the listening felt more like a drill in attention, line by line, image by image. The room's acoustics were bright. A cough, a program folded, a shoe scuffed the floorboards. Each sound briefly stood out before dissolving into the gathered hush. Churchill's arrival registered not as spectacle, but as a tightening of focus, like shutters drawn in an orderly house. He greeted his hosts with the amiable formality of a practiced statesman who had visited many halls like this, though seldom with such a recent war behind him. He spoke at first with the warm notes expected of a guest, and the sentences landed lightly. Then the pitch altered, not sharply, but with a steady grip that suggested the outline of a warning. The audience leaned in by instinct. Fulton was far from Berlin and Prague, yet the names of those places lived in the newspapers stacked at the drugstore counter. They belonged to how people now read the weather of the world. If this gathering had a script, it was an improvised one, drawn from the fresh memory of convoys, casualty lists, and the uneasy silence settling across parts of Europe. Two kinds of evidence framed the day in ways a listener could trust: a printed college program that described the visit in plain terms, and a White House travel notice that placed the president and his guest on the same platform with carefully shared duties. Those indicators did not reveal intent, yet they show the event's seriousness without calling attention to itself. The first lines of substance reached back to the war's alliances and the costs borne by men in uniforms now folded into closets. The phrasing was unadorned. He observed that major cities lay damaged, currencies weakened, and political tempers shortened by fatigue. This was not new information for those in the pews, but it felt different to hear it in a steady voice rather than in print. If there was an undertone, it was that victory had crowded out preparation for the morning after. The speaker's cadence suggested that the morning had now arrived and required a new way of speaking between nations previously bound by necessity. The audience met that suggestion with a silence that felt deliberate, not stunned. A small town could hold a large thought without fuss, and this one did, hour by durable hour. The platform's simplicity focused attention on the words rather than the setting. The college, by tradition, honored ideas with ceremonial cloth and clear light through tall windows. That morning it offered a frame adequate to the weight of the subject. No one could say exactly where the argument would lead, only that it would not content itself with the past winter's victories. It aimed for the unsettled spring and for the borders that might harden as the thaw failed to come. The sentences moved with disciplined steps toward a more pointed claim, and the listeners recognized the new shape even before the image was fully named, while ushers near the doors exchanged brief glances and prepared for the crowd's exit that would follow much later. With that tightening mood in place, our attention advances to the words that gave the scene its lasting outline, carried in a figure of speech that sounded plain and yet freighted with the weight of a map. As the phrasing sharpened, the transcript that would circulate later began to write itself line by line at the lectern, where the microphone's wire hummed softly against the polished wood, ready to fix the moment in print and recollection for the days ahead. The turn in the address was deliberate, not theatrical. After reviewing the fragile gains of the piece, the speaker described a line that seemed to have settled over the continent. It did not appear on maps, yet it behaved like a border. Cities and capitals now found themselves on opposite sides of a political screen. Communication slowed, travel narrowed. The authority of local parties tilted toward a single power center to the east. In his account, this formation had not erupted overnight, but had thickened through decrees, police actions, and reorganized ministries that operated with a common rhythm. He gave a list of place names that marched across the continent from the north to the south, and the hall understood that the geography was not ornamental. Each name meant a new restriction or a post-war committee standing in for a more open assembly. The image that fixed the matter was spare. The phrase called to mind a curtain brought down on a stage, but here the stage was a patchwork of countries still rebuilding rail stations and water mains. The point was not that a war would begin again tomorrow. It was that a closing off had already started yesterday. He urged vigilance, patience, and an organized habit among the free nations to speak clearly, to trade fairly, and to defend agreements without noise. The advice was practical rather than grand. He asked for rearmament in the sense of readiness, for coordinated policy rather than reckless posturing. He acknowledged the sacrifices of the Soviet Union and did not deny the scale of its suffering. Yet he traced how influence had hardened into dominance, where elections turned to rituals and newspapers learned new silences. He did not claim to know every intention in Moscow. He suggested instead that the pattern visible on the ground might yield the same results whether designed or drifted toward, and that the difference would not ease the problem for those living under it. Two pieces of record gave the hall a sense of footing: a speech transcript that would be reprinted in American newspapers within the week, and a monitoring summary that referred to the address in cautious terms as it traveled through official channels. Those indicators cannot exhaust the meaning of the moment, but they anchor the scene in recognizable paperwork. The rhetoric never tipped into panic. It was the measured voice of a man who had read reports late into the night and held long conversations with allies who had witnessed local committees take hold where independent parties had stood. The call to action was baler twine and ledger books rather than flags and drums. Coordinate policy, honor treaties, resist appeasement of every small encroachment that erodes a larger settlement. He proposed consultation, not crusade. He suggested an alliance of information as much as arms, a habit of sharing intelligence on small changes that layered over time, become a new order. The hall took this as both reassurance and a test. Reassurance because the appeal remained within the bounds of discipline and law. A test because it implied that the next decade might demand the same quiet persistence that had carried the last. The speech then returned to the necessity of American engagement in European affairs, not as a permanent occupation, but as a stabilizing presence with economic and moral force. He praised the resilience of the British Commonwealth and invited an understanding between the English-speaking democracies that was firm, transparent, and patient. To some, the proposal sounded like a continuation of wartime partnership in a new register. To others, it sounded like a rubric for contest that might never end. He did not prescribe a blueprint, and he declined to dramatize the stakes. He described a slope and the warning signs along it: shuttered party offices, centralized trade unions with narrowed mandates, and public meetings that produced unanimous votes with remarkable speed. If the map of Europe could not yet show the new line, daily life could. The audience measured this against their own routines of school boards, town councils, and editors who argued out loud in public letters. There was no demand for a demonstration, only a call to maintain the capacity for disagreement. When the line about the descending boundary settled into the air, the quiet in the chapel felt heavier. Applause came, then faltered, then came again, as if the room felt the appropriateness of respect and the burden of what respect now implied. The address moved toward its close with a calm reminder that strength and restraint would be equally necessary. The platform yielded no spectacle as the last sentence landed. There was only the sound of shoes against the aisle and the murmur of people thinking about trains in Europe that no longer ran on familiar timetables. With the phrase now loose in the newspapers, the next scene moves from the college to the desks where officials and editors considered how to carry or counter this new vocabulary, beginning with Washington notes and London cables filed in the days that followed. The days after the address unfolded in steady layers shaped by office routines and the pace of the Postal Service. In Washington, desks filled with clippings and typed summaries. Senior officials read the remarks against their own briefings, marking margins with short pencil strokes. The American public was not of one mind. Some readers took the speech as a needed clarity about a pattern already visible in dispatches from Eastern and Central Europe. Others saw it as a tightening turn from wartime partnership to peacetime suspicion. Editorial pages split. A few metropolitan papers called the warning prudent and overdue. Others argued that such wording could sharpen tensions at the edge of a fragile settlement. The British reaction mirrored this range, with praise for the lucidity of the warning and unease about the cost of sustaining a long vigilance in an economy still rationed and rebuilding. Moscow's early signals were cool and formal. There was no public frenzy, only notes that registered displeasure with the tone and the implications. On the American side, the president kept a balanced distance, acknowledging Churchill's stature while not endorsing every line. This stance allowed room for later adjustments and preserved the flexibility of ongoing talks. A pair of documentary traces helps fix this part of the story without exaggeration. A State Department press briefing outline that treated the speech as a private citizen's view informed by wartime experience, and a file of editorial extracts circulated among policy staff to gauge the national temper. Those indicators point to careful watching rather than immediate realignment. In small towns far from Fulton, barbershops and diners carried the conversation forward in clipped exchanges. The phrase about a curtain entered ordinary speech with surprising speed, not as an iron law, but as a useful shorthand for a pattern that many suspected. In Europe, diplomats weighed local developments in Poland, Hungary, and the Balkans against the new American talk. Some believed the phrase might stiffen Western resolve, promoting tighter coordination in relief and reconstruction. Others worried that it might lock both sides into a vocabulary that would be hard to walk back. The British Foreign Office held its own council with understated discipline, aware that practical needs, coal shipments, dollar loans, shipping lanes, would decide more than a single oration. In university common rooms, scholars compared the address to past moments when a public speech crystallized a direction already present in private memoranda. They noted that the speaker had offered no timetable and no threat, only a reading of conditions that could grow harder if left unattended. Across the Atlantic, committees met, minutes taken in compact handwriting, noting with restraint that the term might influence parliamentary debate and public morale. In the American Midwest, the college returned to routine, lectures resumed, and the chapel stood quiet again, though its name now traveled farther than it ever had. The persistence of the phrase in print suggested that the warning would have a longer half-life than most commentary, yet predictions remained guarded. If there was a consensus among cautious readers, it was that the relationship with the Soviet Union had entered a slower, narrower channel, and that policy would now be tested in the small measures of relief, exchange and access. Across offices, the practical work went on. Shipments were approved, visas were argued, conference agendas were adjusted by a line or two. The speech did not transform these processes. It provided a new sentence with which to argue about their direction. This was not a moment of rupture, it was a moment of fixation, when a metaphor settled into the vocabulary of officials and ordinary people and began to shape how they filed reports and interpreted daily events. On the ground in Europe, power continued to consolidate in familiar ways, and Western ministries took closer notice of the speed and extent of that consolidation. Policy aides drafted talking points that reused the phrase in moderate tones, then crossed it out to avoid provocation, then restored it when clarity seemed worth the risk. The coming months would see whether the language hardened policy or policy softened the language. For now, the first ripple had reached desks and doorsteps, and attention turned to the next exchanges between London and Washington, where cables and speeches would continue to shape and temper the meaning of Fulton's winter message. From the editorial split and the steady public chatter, the center of gravity shifted to the desks that handled cables between London and Washington, where vocabulary itself became a matter of judgment. The first task on each side was to define the address without overstating it. British officials read the text with the plain caution of a government balancing recovery at home with commitments overseas. Their replies referenced currency strain, shipping priorities, imperial communications, and a schedule of obligations that did not leave room for open-ended confrontations. American officials, for their part, placed the speech alongside briefing folders that had thickened since the winter, with accounts of party consolidations and press regulations to the east. The conversation in both capitals remained disciplined and procedural. It circled the same pair of questions, stated in practical terms: how to show steadiness without drift, and how to avoid gestures that might raise the temperature beyond what the situation could bear. Draft language for public use moved back and forth. Phrases were tightened, then softened, then set aside in favor of formulations that signaled resolve while leaving space for adjustment. The preference was for verbs like consult, support, coordinate, observe. There was little appetite for the rhetoric of crusade, and even less for threats that could not be honored within current budgets and troop levels. British readers kept a close eye on how any new vocabulary might affect loan arrangements and Parliament's tolerance for extended commitments. Americans watched Congress as much as foreign capitals, aware that public patience could shorten if the bills for overseas steadiness appeared to rise without clear purpose. Among the practical constraints, shipping tonnage and coal deliveries mattered more than slogans. A quiet note in one office would calculate how many tons of fuel were needed to keep one city's trams running through the month, while another office weighed how many instructors and clerks could be spared for administrative missions abroad. The texture of those days was not romantic. It was clerical, careful, and sustained by people who had spent the war learning to make large choices feel like a string of small ones. Two documentary indicators framed the transatlantic mood with modest certainty: a Foreign Office circular digest that summarized the American press reaction without comment, and a State Department memorandum of conversation that recorded a senior official's view that the speech should be handled as the reading of an experienced statesman rather than as a directive. These items did not settle anything. They simply fixed the tone, which was measured. Each side also reviewed monitoring summaries of the Soviet press, which presented the speech as an unfriendly turn, but not yet a break. The working judgment in London and Washington was to preserve channels and to keep the vocabulary of cooperation available, even as both sides acknowledged that everyday practice in Eastern and Central Europe was moving in the opposite direction. Staffers noted that ordinary administrative matters, spare parts, visas, air corridors, could serve as both choke points and signals. Each successful clearance was read as a sign that a floor of cooperation still existed. Each obstruction hinted that the floor was thinner than hoped. The focus remained on preventing the metaphor that had left Fulton from becoming self-fulfilling. Officials therefore preferred to test the boundary through routine interactions rather than public challenges. In that way, they could map the limits without forcing them into prominence. For this reason, draft statements were pruned of verbal flourishes that would travel poorly and accumulate interpretations not intended by their authors. On the British side, the press office sought to avoid language that would inflame ration-weary readers. On the American side, the emphasis fell on unity among departments, so that no bureau would imply a policy shift not yet agreed. Both capitals also compared notes with Ottawa and Canberra in the practical spirit of Commonwealth coordination and habit-formed wartime ties. The result was a tone of deliberate calm that, in hindsight, gave the appearance of drift, but in the moment felt like the only workable speed. It was during these adjustments that the image from Fulton settled into official shorthand, not for public display, but for internal clarity. When one cable observed that a certain move might lower the curtain further along a specific corridor, the phrase had already done its work. It named a gradient without declaring a fight. By late spring, the immediate turbulence around the address had given way to barrages of routine, and the question became how this vocabulary would be carried into upcoming committee meetings, where chairs, speakers, and agendas would harden or soften the practical shape of the relationship. With that, attention edges toward the European desks that confronted the terms of the speech on the ground, in cities where tram schedules, party lists, and police notices offered the clearest readings of the season. In the months that followed, the image coined in a small American town was tested against the texture of European life. The testing did not unfold through dramatic incidents. It took shape in party congresses held in large halls, in the publication schedules of newspapers, and in quiet adjustments to municipal policing and trade union leadership. In Prague and Warsaw, the newspaper columns narrowed around a sanctioned line, even as some editors held to a clipped style that left small spaces for ambiguity. In Budapest, committee appointments accumulated with a steadiness that seemed procedural until one traced the pattern of consolidations over several weeks. Vienna remained a place of layered jurisdictions where small permits acquired a political weight, and the four-power framework made each permit a small referendum on what cooperation could still achieve. Berlin's zones sat as both a lesson and a warning. The city remained a living ledger in which every rail car and meeting room recorded the narrow margin by which cooperation could be maintained. The question for local administrators was how to push their cases through channels that grew more formal by the day. Requests for newsprint, repairs, and office space could become obstacles or leverage depending on which office received them and how quickly replies came back. The public rarely saw these decisions, but they noticed their results. Thinner newspapers, crowded meeting rooms, and voter rolls that changed with every new regulation. Police orders spoke a language that was calm in tone and firm in effect. The outward aim was stability in a population still exhausted from war. The inward effect was a reduction of disorder and of dissent at the same time. The metaphor from Fulton did not appear in official notices, yet the feeling of partition spread through practical inconveniences like travel passes and conference invitations. Two steady indicators gave the period an archival backbone: Allied Control Council minutes, which recorded debates about access and administration with meticulous neutrality, and open-source press summaries compiled in various capitals that tracked shifts in vocabulary and emphasis across multiple newspapers. Those documents, later consulted by scholars and staffers alike, showed how policy hardened along the seams of routine rather than proclamation. Western officials in the field calibrated their tone day by day. They avoided gestures that would appear as tests of strength and preferred visits, school exchanges, or industrial surveys that kept contact alive without public friction. When a survey team counting machine tools in a mid-sized factory encountered a new set of permissions, the change was logged and forwarded. When a visiting lecturer found that a public hall was no longer available for neutral topics, the note traveled in the same fashion. None of these items seemed decisive in isolation. Together they drew a line that felt familiar to those who had read the Fulton text. Relief officials, meanwhile, focused on calories, shelter, and coal. Their language remained deliberately apolitical, and their ledgers did not mention curtains of any kind. Yet supply routes that had once been inconvenient became sensitive, and a stalled truck convoy on a wet road could start a chain of calls that reached far beyond the local district. Western European governments balanced sympathy for neighbors to the east with concerns about their own elections and their own budgets, which were not infinite and depended on credits negotiated far away. In Paris, the political calendar drove a rhythm of speeches and counter-speeches that pulled attention back to domestic priorities. In Rome, the church bells that marked the hours rang over markets where talk of foreign alignments had to compete with the price of bread and oil. The speech from Fulton traveled through these places as a phrase used in passing, a sign that one was not naive about the weather. Yet very few could afford to live by phrases alone. A school board needed chalk. A clinic needed lamp oil. A town council had to decide whether to allow a meeting that would draw a crowd larger than the room could hold. Under such conditions, philosophy mattered less than process. The boundaries named in Missouri thus became visible as delays and closures, as careful welcomes extended to some groups and not to others, as quiet omissions in public calendars. Western missions were reminded to mind their manners, to keep receipts, and to make no promise that could not be kept within the next quarter. The mood was not panic. It was the tamped-down seriousness of a continent that had just hauled itself out of ruins and did not want to be told that another descent was imminent. Even so, the map felt altered, and seasoned clerks carried that feeling into the evening hours when they prepared tomorrow's lists. Our path now follows the way those lists fed into policy, where offices in London and Washington translated practical reports into lines for speeches and budget tables for legislatures that would decide how much patience and how many resources this steadiness would require through the end of the year. By the latter half of 1946, the first season of reaction had settled, and a slower season of shaping began. The transatlantic conversation parsed what was feasible within the limits of manpower and credit. American demobilization continued, and with it came the need to justify missions abroad in clear, modest terms. British planning, stretched by obligations in multiple regions and by home front austerity, favored limited aims with clear exits. The emphasis fell on information sharing, training programs for civil administration, economic credits tied to transparent use, and a habit of consultation that kept surprises to a minimum. There was no appetite for declarations. Instead, chairs were chosen for committees, agendas fixed to topics that could be handled without loud dispute, and lines drafted for speeches that would be given by figures whose words carried weight without inviting drama. The underlying judgment remained the same across offices: to hold the center quietly by canny routines and to let practice bind what treaties alone could not. If the Fulton phrasing provided a frame, it did so as a shared metaphor among staff who needed a short way to mark certain trends. A pair of reference points guided the months ahead: a United Nations session agenda, listing items that touched on access and oversight in contested regions, and a joint planning note between Allied departments that laid out a schedule for coordinated statements and for modest technical missions to promote common standards in customs, transport, and relief distribution. These papers were not ornate. They read like calendars and checklists, the language of people building a lattice strong enough to carry heavier policy if and when legislators agreed to it. In the background, the aftermath of earlier winter analyses continued to influence tone. Reports that had traveled under separate cover from Europe were now part of a working library that junior officers studied. The reading reminded them that strong terms could be useful for clarity, but that strong measures had to be paid for in cash and credibility. Any attempt to anchor policy in Fulton's stronger sentences would need to explain costs at town halls and in committee hearings. The compromise, if it can be called that, was to proceed with a bias toward steadiness and mutual reassurance among allies, to avoid gestures that could be misread across borders, and to treat every small incident as an opportunity to reassert process. In this sense, the months became an exercise in administrative stamina. Press officers prepared neutral language for small confrontations at checkpoints. Military liaison teams filed reports that described incidents without adjectives. Financial officers prepared tables that showed how credits could be extended without inviting panic in currency markets. There were arguments, and tempers occasionally rose behind closed doors, but the official face showed restraint, a word that appeared often in the margin notes of drafts. The season had its dramas, though they were measured in room temperature and the length of pauses before answers. Delegations at international meetings spoke in long paragraphs that sounded careful because they were. Each capital understood that a misplaced phrase could travel far and constrain choice later. Meanwhile, domestic audiences absorbed the new vocabulary with a kind of weary acceptance. They had their own troubles: housing shortages, price controls, the shift from war goods to consumer goods, and foreign policy could not command their attention for long without showing practical benefit. That fact alone pushed planners toward modest steps that would not exhaust patience at home. The metaphor of a curtain, by now embedded in common talk, gave cohesion to these choices without demanding a spectacle. It suggested a border to be watched, not a frontier to be charged. If some among the Allied staffs wished for bolder moves, their preference did not translate into policy during this season. At most, it produced draft speeches that applauded firmness and then folded back into the language of careful partnership. In that mix of hope, worry, and routine, the Fulton speech took on the character of a threshold event, not a cause of what followed and not a verdict upon it, but a way of naming tensions already felt in cables and corridors that would guide the next set of commitments. As winter approached again, offices prepared reports that would inform addresses at the turn of the year, and the scene narrows toward a table piled with marked transcripts and penciled notes, where a new line is being tested for public use, while the previous line still echoes in the paper trail that made it necessary to write another. The hall in Fulton returned to routine within days, yet the sentence that settled there traveled far, held in folders and newsprint that moved across desks from Missouri to London to small offices in provincial capitals. The account you have heard is a reconstruction shaped by published transcripts, archived press roundups, and routine memoranda that recorded tone as much as content. It keeps to 1946 and to the credible habits of that year: meeting agendas, loans under debate, rations and travel passes that controlled who could cross a city at dusk. From those materials, a contour emerges without final certainty. A vocabulary shifted. Reports changed their emphasis. Administrators learned new caution in the way they scheduled meetings and approved permits. Whether the metaphor from Westminster College hardened policy or simply described it remains open. Did the phrase provide a useful shorthand that spared officials the false comfort of vagueness? Or did it begin to fix expectations that narrowed choices later on? Did it protect time for reconstruction? Or did it tax public patience that was already thin? The sources point in both directions, and the distance between them is where judgment must live. As the year declines into another cold season, papers stack in orderly piles, and the words from Fulton hold their place among them. Ahead lie further statements, more minutes, small incidents to be contained, and exchanges that may either confirm the boundary or propose a new way to mark it. The next file to open belongs to the planners who draft the winter addresses and decide which lines will be saved and which will be left to the margins. Our path continues at their tables, where a sentence can still set the frame for what follows.